And thank you so much for hosting. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Trauma-Informed Teaching Practices for Adult Learners. My name is Andrea Eckelberger, and I am I work with Literacy Minnesota for 6 years. I was the ESL training coordinator at Literacy Minnesota. But 2 weeks ago, I transferred, and I am now working at a school district working with literacy learners. I've been out of the classroom for 6 years and I missed it. And so I went back in so I can be applying all these practices that we're going to be talking about today. I want to be applying them in person. But I'm so happy to be able to continue to work with Literacy Minnesota and to be able to be here with all of you today. And I've been watching the introductions rolling in of people coming and joining from all over the state. So thanks for having me. I'm really glad that we're all going to be here and moving through this trauma-informed teaching practices session together. Just a quick note, if you haven't heard of Literacy Minnesota before, it is worth checking out the website. It's literacymn.org. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat, and so you can see that. But we have a ton of resources on there, including a lot of free educator resources. Free is 99% of the stuff that we have is free. So definitely, if you haven't checked us out before, go and see what educator resources we have that you might find to be helpful for you in your teaching, because we have so much stuff for adult education. So like I said, I'm watching the introductions roll in, so I know that everybody is chatting, which is good because we're going to be doing a lot of chatting today. And thank you, Brandy, for the, yes, we have a lot of resources on there, including videos of teaching in adult classrooms that people might find to be helpful. So I know everybody has been using the chat. We are going to go ahead and use the chat. We're going to do a brief warm-up. And we're going to do a warm-up that is one of the practices I'm going to be mentioning later on in our session. So pausing for a moment to think about gratitude. What is one thing that you feel gratitude for right now? It can be as simple as the weather. It can be your family. It might be a meal or an event, a person, a thing, life, health, beach. Great. Somebody has a pet donkey. I am really jealous. I'm seeing a lot of family, work, family, health. Looks like someone else has a new job. And I saw a number of people saying just the work, being able to work with the learners. All right, so typed in something about gratitude. I want you to pause for just a moment. Picture whatever it is that you feel grateful for in your mind. Just stop and picture it. And I am so happy to see that your mom survived COVID. That is something to feel gratitude right now. Yeah, so just pause, picture what you feel grateful for in your mind. All right, we're gonna keep going, but hopefully the idea is when you picture that thing that you feel gratitude for, kind of shifts your mindset a little bit and trains your mind to be thinking about what's good instead of our instinctual focusing on what we are stressed and worried about, which is so easy to do right now and completely normal. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. And because we have such a large group, we're going to be communicating through the chat. So I'll be periodically inviting people to pause, put things in the chat. We'll be doing lots of reflection. And there might be times where I'll actually pause for like 3 to 4 minutes and let you think and formulate, maybe write some notes down before I ask you to respond in the chat. So We're going to make this session as interactive as possible with this large group, and we'll have time at the end so I can answer some questions. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about what's going on in there, the impact of stress and trauma on the brain. We're going to talk about how stress and trauma impact adult learning. And we're going to talk about how can we create learning environments where everyone can thrive. So we're going to be, throughout the webinar, answering these three kind of big questions. So I want to start us off with some working assumptions. And before I do this, I also want to make a disclaimer. I am an adult education teacher. I've been in the field since 2003, working with adults, and I've done teaching, I've done training. I am not a licensed therapist, but what I have done is talked to a lot of licensed therapists, done a lot of reading, and really kind of distill down what can we actually do in the classroom that is practical and something that we can apply immediately, as well as thinking about the long-term health of our learners in the classroom environment, and then teachers ourselves. So I will do my best to answer questions that come in through the chat. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the chat. I'm going to answer questions as they come through. There may be questions that I am not able to answer, but I will make sure that if I'm not able to answer a question, I'll try to point you towards some resources where you can find the answer yourself. So we want to kick off with some working assumptions. So what are some things that we should all have in place as we are thinking about doing and talking about trauma-informed teaching in our classrooms? And the first one is that trauma is not limited to an individual event and does not always involve violence. Traumatic experiences can be chronic, such as poverty, systemic, for example, mass incarceration, naturally occurring, fire, flood, disease, and yes, we are all living through a collective community traumatic event right now. That is happening. And they can also be historic, such as racial inequity. They can stem from bias, misunderstanding, and aggression based on or around gender, sexuality, physical and mental health, immigration status, etc. The list goes on, as well as any combination. Second working assumption is that trauma does not discriminate. Traumatic experiences happen to adults from all backgrounds, socioeconomic levels, races, genders, etc. Third working assumption is people should not be defined by their potential traumatic experiences. It's a part of their life, woven into their current roles and responsibilities, or their personal community responses to them. And also to acknowledge that people respond to potential trauma differently, and they heal and move forward differently. So what is debilitating to one person may be less so for another. I think my sum up with that would be trauma isn't relative. Something that is incredibly traumatic to one person might be mildly traumatic to another person, or something that is not traumatic to you at all might be very traumatic to somebody else. And we can't compare trauma because all of us have different brains. So knowing, as people who are working with adults, individuals' actions are a direct result of their experiences. And when a learner acts out or is disengaged, the question we should be asking ourselves is not what's wrong with you, but rather, what happened to you? And finally, and this is something that I really have to remember and focus myself on, is that it's not the responsibility of the teacher to heal the learners. it's the role of adult education to provide a supportive, welcoming, and productive learning environment. We're teachers, we're administrators, we're not licensed therapists. We're going to be talking about some of those universal designs for learning, UDL, things that we can do that are going to make our classes feel safer and more secure for all of students, not just students who have experienced trauma or are experiencing toxic levels of stress. Okay. So another thing that we're going to do as we are kicking off is a grounding practice. And we're going to do this for a few reasons. Number one is it's something that you can absolutely do in your classes. If you use things like this, check in with your learners and ask them how they feel about it. But also, it's really important for us to ground ourselves because for the next hour and 45 minutes, and we will take a 5-minute break in the middle, I promise, we are going to be talking about some hard things. Talking and learning about trauma and stress is difficult. This is a hard topic, and memories might be coming up for you, things that you've experienced or things that you've heard from learners, family members, neighbors, colleagues. So we're going to do a grounding practice to center ourselves for being able to have this conversation and learn this information. But I'm also going to ask you as part of this grounding practice to take care of yourselves in whatever way you need to. So that might mean you get up and walk away from the computer. That's fine. If that's what you need to do, if things are coming up, feel free to do that. I give you permission to do self-care while we are having this session. But we're going to begin with our grounding practice. And this is taken, I'm going to put this in the chat as well, from My Grandmother's Hands, which is a book by Resmaa Menakem. And Resmaa Menakem is a local practitioner in Minneapolis. And this book, My Grandmother's Hands, is about racialized trauma and the pathways to mending our hearts and bodies. It is pretty phenomenal. I recommend it very, very highly. If you are interested in doing some self-work around trauma, particularly around racialized trauma. And this book is written for people from all backgrounds, including there are sections for people who identify as BIPOC, sections for people who identify as white. And Resmaa Menakem has also done a great deal of work with working with police officers around trauma and trauma that they experience in their jobs and helping people process through that. And in Minneapolis, Minnesota, this has been incredibly important work. So I highly recommend this book. And throughout the book, he has grounding practices. And so we are going to begin the session by doing one of his grounding practices called Coming into the Room. So I'm going to invite all of you to please participate with me and just follow along. Coming into the room. Sit comfortably in a chair. Close your eyes and take a few deep breaths. Imagine you're floating in space. Below you, planet Earth turns slowly. Watch it turn for a few seconds. Slowly descend until the part of the country you're in fills your field of vision. Stay directly above it, like a GPS satellite, so that it doesn't move beneath you. Keep descending until you're looking down on whatever city, town, mountain, valley, or other area your body is sitting in right now. Continue your descent until you're looking down at the top of the building you're in. If you're seated outdoors, descend far enough so that you can see your own body below, as if you're viewing it from a helicopter. Keep dropping slowly and steadily until you can see your body in detail, as if you're about 10 feet above it. Observe your body's posture, any movements it makes, and the clothing it's wearing. Slowly and smoothly, descend the rest of the way and slip inside your body. For a few breaths, simply be aware of being in your body. Relax and let the chair support you. Then notice the sensation of the chair against your legs and thighs. Then notice how it feels against your back. Open your eyes. Orient yourself by looking around you, including behind you. Return to the here and now. All right. Thank you, everybody, for doing that grounding practice. Absolutely, as we'll be talking about later, this is something that you might be interested in using with your students, a simple grounding practice, even if it's just taking 3 deep breaths at the beginning of class. It doesn't have to be as in-depth as what we just did. I'll be going ahead and sharing a PDF of these slides. I'll send that out afterwards and to Nancy. And so it can the slides can hopefully be shared with people because there's a lot of links embedded in them. For example, here is a link to the ASIO Area Learning Center's virtual calming room. And so this is something that they started during the pandemic. They have sounds and music, links for visual relaxation, guided practice, resources, and recommendations for apps. And so this was created for students. All right, we are going to talk about what's going on in there, the impact of stress and trauma in the brain. And before we talk particularly about stress and trauma, we are going to talk about memory, because memory is a lot of what we is impacted when people have stress and trauma and then are struggling to learn in classes. So we have different types of memory. We have our short-term memory, which is like the brain's Post-it note. It holds a small amount of information, 7 items or less. And it's in an active, readily available state for 10 to 15 seconds, up to a minute. So for an example, if you are doing math and you're carrying over a number and doing a math problem, if you are remembering an argument, kind of what you want to say when it's your turn to talk in a conversation. If you have where you try to log into something on your computer and then you get the code on your phone and you have to remember that code to put it in your computer so that you can get into your bank account. That is short-term memory. Next, we have working memory. And working memory is often kind of conflated with short-term memory, but it's not quite the same thing. Because working memory is the ability to hold and manipulate information over brief intervals. And it allows us to work with information without losing track of what we're doing. And so, for example, if you need to remember a phone number, a shopping list, or a set of instructions, you're relying on your working memory. It's that ability to hold and manipulate the information. And it's for things that are important for you now in the present moment, but probably won't be 20 years from now. And researchers tend to think of working memory, it's the gateway into long-term storage. And if you rehearse the information in working memory enough, then the memory is going to become more permanent. And it helps the brain, this working memory helps the brain organize new information for that long-term storage going into the long-term memory. And if people have trouble with working memory, and what we're going to talk about with stress and trauma, what's generally being impacted is this working memory. The brain might store information in a jumbled way, or they might not store it in the long term at all. Also, you might find your working memory just isn't working as well, that you are forgetting things that you just heard. So working memory is really what students and learners are using in class as they are processing, working with information. And the working memory is what they need to work through first before things are go into their long-term memory. So long-term memory is when we work through that working memory and make a conscious effort to retain short-term memory. And we do this with repetition is really the most common, particularly when we are learning a language or when we are learning a new skill like math or being able to do academic writing for a high school equivalency test. Meaningful association, where you have, for example, learning a new language, mnemonic devices. This word sounds like this word, and so I can picture it in my head. Or this reminds me of an experience I had. Also, emotion really helps us to can turn something that would normally be a short-term memory into a long-term memory when you have an emotion associated with it. And in the chat, do you think that our brains tend to hold on to memories, create long-term memories that are based more on positive or negative emotions? Oh yeah, negative. Yep. Sadly, it's negative, which makes sense. That developed from our brains so that we could remember, over there's a saber-toothed tiger, or my aunt ate those berries and she died, and so I should not eat those berries. So it's our brain's way of trying to keep us alive by holding on to those negative memories. Unfortunately, we've really evolved to a point where it's no longer helpful and is actually can be harmful to us. But that's the way the brain works. So we have this working memory that is doing this cognitive processing to us. It's doing repetition. It's making meaningful association. It's maybe attaching things with emotion. And then these memories are consolidated by the hippocampus, which is a small area in the middle of our brain. And that's where those short-term working memories are turned into long-term memories. And they're then stored in these neural connections throughout the brain. So we have short-term memory, which is kind of just that second you remember it and then you move on to the next thing. You don't think about it again. We have the working memory, which there's a lot of debate how long we can hold things in our working memory. But the working memory is what's happening in classes as people are learning, practicing things, kind of holding on to what they need to get through the lesson. And when we do enough repetition, when there's meaningful association, then things are turned into those long-term memories where we can access them later on. But we also have different types of long-term memories. I'm going to talk about just two of them, ones that are particularly associated to things that we learn in school and when we're talking about language, if you're working with adult language learners. So we have our procedural memory. And procedural memory uses past experiences to remember things without even having to think about them. So like that expression, it's like riding a bike. You might have been 20 years, but you get on your bike and your body just remembers and knows what to do. You don't have to think about what to do. And so when we're talking about, language development, this procedural memory is really important because it allows a person to talk without having to think about proper grammar and syntax. You just say it, you just pronounce the word that way. And when they've done research, they've found that children, generally under the age of 7 tend to pick up new memories or new languages using procedural memory. So I talk about like children's brains are sponges for language. It's because they're not thinking about their learning. They're just kind of absorbing it, processing it, trying it out, and it becomes procedural. They don't even have to think about it. And they've done research on brain scans where people who are bilingual, and they have them think and talk in both languages that they learned under the age of 7, and the exact same areas of the brain are lighting up when they're thinking or speaking in both language when they learn it young. So the languages are learned as children the same way. They're procedural memory. And then we have declarative memory. So declarative memory is memory of facts and events that we have to consciously be recalling. And what they found is that adults tend to learn the rules and vocabulary of a new language, or going beyond language learners of a new skill, how to do algebra, how to use particular writing forms. We're using declarative memory. And what they found is when they are looking at, I find this brain research really interesting, when they look at adults who are bilingual, fluently bilingual, but learned a second language when they were older, like in their teens or early 20s. And what they found is when people think and speak in either language, the languages are spatially separated in the part of the frontal lobe that is responsible for the motor parts of the language, the movement of the mouth and the tongue, and the inside of your mouth. So that can be, if somebody's learning a new language, or if you've learned a new language where you know what to say, but you just can't get it out, it's because your brain might be looking in the wrong place for how to move your mouth to say the words. So we have our different types of memory. We have short-term working, which is what happens in class. And then the goal is to turn those working memories, that information is being processed into working memories, into the long-term memory. And since we're working with adults, people are going to be using declarative memory. They have to, at least at first, consciously recall it. Declarative memory can become kind of instantaneous. If you practice something enough, you develop that automaticity when you're accessing memories constantly. However, in the beginning, we have to really consciously recall the skill that we're doing. So it's important to know about memory because what we're going to be talking about with trauma and also trauma's best friend, stress, these really impact people's memories. And the more your memory is impacted, the harder it is to be successful as a learner. But we need to acknowledge that when we're talking about stress, not all stress is created equal. There are different types of stress. We have what we call positive stress responses. And positive stress responses evolved to save your life, to get you out of a situation, to give you that burst of cortisol and adrenaline, to be able to get away from the danger, to be able to move yourself through that stressful situation. Positive stress responses tend to be brief, and your body pretty quickly returns back to the baseline of where it's supposed to be. Next, we have tolerable stress responses. Tolerable stress responses, they work the same in our brain and body as positive stress responses, but they are much longer and stronger, and it takes a lot longer for the brain to return to that baseline kind of calm where it's supposed to be. So positive tolerable stress responses might be caused by, moving to a new community, moving to a new country. Could be, something that's prolonged, it goes on, a divorce, death of a loved one. it's hard, it hurts, but eventually your body system regulates and returns you back to normal, to that baseline. But then what we need to watch out for is toxic stress responses. And toxic stress responses are that ongoing stress that doesn't let up. And this is what can really impact your body. And this tolerable and toxic stress response might be what we're seeing in learners who are struggling in classes. So I'm going to play a short video that is going to talk a little bit more about what stress does to the brain in particular, so that you have some nice visuals and images as you're learning about it. So this is about a 3-minute video. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera while the video is playing. And then after this, we are going to be moving on to talking about trauma.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
All right, so when I acknowledge I saw some requests coming in, I turned it up as much as I could. But again, I'll share the PDF of all these slides, and that has a links to all the videos embedded. And so if you want to go back and watch anything, you'll be able to do that after the session. So just to do a quick summary of this, for people who are having a challenging time hearing, we have the different levels of stress responses. But when we have that cortisol that is continuously flooding the body from toxic stress responses, it actually shrinks the hippocampus. And the next thing we're going to be talking about is PTSD, trauma and PTSD. And they found, feels like interesting isn't quite the right word, but really interesting results looking at the brains of veterans who were suffering from PTSD and found their hippocampus had shrunk by about 7%. But as I said in the video, that actually is reversible when people are able to get treatment and are able to move on when the stress goes away, although it can take a very long time for the body to re-regulate and go back to that kind of calm baseline. And when they did some tests on adults, they found, and as we'll be talking about in the next section, that stress really has a great impact on people's ability to form the new memories. So what are some stressors that adult learners might be experiencing right now? What are some things that you can think of that learners in your classes might be struggling with, that might be causing stress? First few things that came in are money. Oh, math. Math anxiety is very real and well documented. I'm seeing language barriers, job loss, COVID, grief, food, relationships, horrible children, documentation status for immigrants, immigration status, having children at home, worrying about family members, friends, or your native country. Absolutely. Not being able to get to school. I've seen transportation come up a lot. And that fear of failure. So we just came up with a massive list of what people might be stressed about. And I see no stability in anything. So there's probably not just one thing that learners are experiencing stress about. There's probably multiple things. And as we're going to see in the next section, yes, that does impact people's ability to learn because they have cortisol, excess cortisol in their body that is telling them that they are not safe and that they should feel anxious and feel worried about it. So the next thing we're going to talk about, like I said, stress's BFF is trauma. And so we are going to do a brief overview of PTSD and trauma. So kind of trauma 101. So again, I have a short video, about a 3-minute video, but I'm going to give you some information and watch a video, and I'll do a quick recap if people are having some issues with the sound. And again, you can watch the video afterwards if that is going to be more helpful for you. So now, during a stressful event, the sympathetic nervous system activates that fight, flight, or freeze, like we saw with the stress, and that stress hormone cortisol is released. And like we saw in the previous video, normally when the stressor goes away, the parasympathetic nervous system responds and returns the body to normal, to that baseline. However, when we're talking about trauma, it's caused by unusually large amounts of stress. There's excess cortisol that's released in the body. And this can turn into PTSD. Not in everybody, as we'll see in the video, but that PTSD can make that traumatic event continue and make that high level of cortisol continue, which damages that CA3 neurons in the hippocampus. So again, when they were looking at the brains of veterans that were suffering from PTSD, they found that hippocampus had actually shrunk by about 7%. So people who have experienced trauma and then are suffering from PTSD as a result of that, it can really impact people's ability to form those new memories. It impacts the working memory, which in turn impacts people's long-term memories. And that really affects people's ability to learn. In particular, verbal learning can be affected. So they've found that people who are experiencing negative effects of trauma tend to have difficulty retaining information that they hear compared to information that they see. And one of the really big things, with the working memory, we need to be, the whole point of that is that you're paying attention and you're holding on and manipulating information and doing cognitive processing. And if you aren't able to pay attention because your brain has experienced trauma and is focused on the threats around you, that really affects your ability to learn because it's impacting your sustained and focused attention that you need to process things through the working memory and turn it into a long-term memory. Right, so we're going to do a short video. It's about 3.5 minutes talking about what is PTSD and how does it impact the brain. I do want to just warn people that this is animated. However, it does describe some traumatic events, including house fires, rape, and physical and domestic abuse. So know that those words are going to be coming up and that there will be some cartoon depictions of those events. So again, if you need to step away, step away. I would like to invite you to do that if that's what works best for you.
Many of us will experience some kind of trauma during our lifetime. Sometimes we escape with no long-term effects, but for millions of us, those experiences linger, causing symptoms like nightmares and negative thoughts that interfere with everyday life. This phenomenon, called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, isn't a personal failing. Rather, it's a treatable malfunction of certain biological mechanisms that allow us to cope with dangerous experiences. To understand PTSD, we first need to understand how the brain processes a wide range of ordeals, including the death of a loved one, domestic violence, injury or illness, abuse, rape, war, car accidents, and natural disasters. These events can bring on feelings of danger and helplessness, which activate the brain's alarm system, known as the fight, flight, freeze response. When this alarm sounds, the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal systems, known as the HPA axis, work together to send signals to the parasympathetic nervous system. That's the network that communicates with adrenal glands and internal organs to help regulate functions like heart rate, digestion, and respiration. These signals start a chemical cascade that floods the body with several different stress hormones, causing physiological changes that prepare the body to defend itself. Our heart rate speeds up, breathing quickens, and muscles tense. Even after a crisis is over, escalated levels of stress hormones may last for days, contributing to jittery feelings, nightmares, and other symptoms. For most people, these experiences disappear within a few days to 2 weeks as their hormone levels stabilize. But a small percentage of those who experience trauma have persistent problems, sometimes vanishing temporarily, only to resurface months later. We don't completely understand what's happening in the brain, but one theory is that the stress hormone cortisol may be continuously activating the fight, flight, freeze response while reducing overall brain functioning, leading to a number of negative symptoms. These symptoms often fall into 4 categories: intrusive thoughts, like dreams and flashbacks, avoiding reminders of the trauma, negative thoughts and feelings like fear, anger, and guilt, and reactive symptoms like irritability and difficulty sleeping. Not everyone has all these symptoms or experiences them to the same extent and intensity. When problems last more than a month, PTSD is often diagnosed. Genetics, ongoing overwhelming stress, and many risk factors like pre-existing mental illnesses or lack of emotional support likely play a role in determining who will experience PTSD. But the underlying cause is still a medical mystery. A major challenge of coping with PTSD is sensitivity to triggers, physical and emotional stimuli that the brain associates with the original trauma. These can be everyday sensations that aren't inherently dangerous, but prompt powerful physical and emotional reactions. For example, the smell of a campfire could evoke the memory of being trapped in a burning house. For someone with PTSD, that memory activates the same neurochemical cascade as the original event. That then stirs up the same feelings of panic and helplessness, as if they're experiencing the trauma all over again. Trying to avoid these triggers, which are sometimes unpredictable, can lead to isolation. That can leave people feeling invalidated, ignored, or misunderstood, like a pause button has been pushed on their lives while the rest of the world continues around them. But there are options. If you think you might be suffering from PTSD, the first step is an evaluation with a mental health professional who can direct you towards the many resources available. Psychotherapy can be very effective for PTSD, helping patients better understand their triggers. And certain medications can make symptoms more manageable, as can self-care practices like mindfulness and regular exercise. What if you notice signs of PTSD in a friend or family member? Social support, acceptance, and empathy are key to helping and recovery. Let them know you believe their account of what they're experiencing, and that you don't blame them for their reactions. If they're open to it, encourage them to seek evaluation and treatment. PTSD has been called the hidden wound because it comes without outward physical signs. But even if it is an invisible disorder, it doesn't have to be a silent one. Mental health conditions impact millions of people around the world, yet are often misunderstood. Check out this playlist to get informed.
So just to do a quick recap, talking about PTSD, and it's when somebody has experienced that severe trauma, they've had that excess amount of cortisol released, and then their body doesn't quite regulate back to normal. The parasympathetic nervous system doesn't reactivate and return their body back to normal. And then when someone experiences a trigger, something that reminds them of a memory, they'll have what is called a flashback, where there's been some fascinating research, and during the break, I'll share my favorite book about this, The Body Keeps the Score. I'll put that in the chat. But it's the part of the brain that regulates time and spatial awareness goes offline. It completely shuts down. So when somebody is having a flashback, it's like they are living, their brain is telling them the experience is happening to them right now. Same level of trauma as when the experience actually happened. And one of the reasons that I am so interested in this topic and became interested as an adult education teacher is because I had a student have a very severe flashback of her family being killed in front of her in one of my classes that I had inadvertently triggered by giving her, we had globes where smart globes, and you could listen to national anthems from different countries. And she was listening to the national anthem of her country and went into a full-on flashback. And it was, I can't even imagine how terrifying it was for her. It was very terrifying for me and for the other students to see that happen. So flashbacks are very real and they're very intense. I have a colleague who does trauma work with refugees. That's her specialty. And she said, a flashback, it's like a firestorm is igniting in people's brains. It's very hard on their brains. Yeah, something I still remember that. And also she stopped coming to school. And I think it was because school was then associated with having a really bad memory. So that's, for me, part of the reason I'm very interested in this work and have done a lot of reading on this topic. All right, so let's talk about our second topic. We'll dig into this before we take our break. How do stress and trauma impact adult learning? So the impact of trauma and stress on learning has, kind of manifests itself in many different ways. The first one is it uses resources that need to be used for learning. It's like having too many tabs open on your computer. When you have too much going on, it's not working. It's very hard to focus on that one thing. So people who've experienced trauma or experiencing toxic stress, their brain is using resources that they should be focusing on their working memory. And since that human body is wired for short bursts of stress, prolonged stress tends to impact people's ability to do math, to process language, to concentrate, and leads to poor long and short-term memories. People tend to experience hypervigilance, always on the lookout for danger, and can be hypersensitive to changes in the voice, body posture, and facial expressions of others. People see threat where there's not supposed to be one. And I love this quote: "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." So if somebody who is experiencing toxic levels of stress, has experienced trauma and is suffering from PTSD, it really changes the way that they see and perceive the world. And we've all probably had that, where something goes wrong and you're having a bad day, and then everything seems like it's going wrong. And it's, that's what you're paying attention to. That's what you're noticing. You're seeing it through the lens of, this is a bad day. Trauma and stress also tend to decrease attention and therefore decrease that working memory. And they found that stressed people tend to not generalize or adapt old pieces of information into new scenarios, as well as non-stressed people. And they found that adults with higher levels of stress performed 50% worse than adults with low levels of stress on tests of declarative memory and executive function. And remember, we use declarative memory. That's the type of memory that's being used when people are learning a new language or a new skill in the classroom. And traumatized people can really have that problems with that sustained attention and focused attention. And so important, because you have to pay attention to something in order to learn it. You can't learn what you don't pay attention to. And if your brain's going in a million different directions, looking for a threat, thinking about how am I going to pay bills? Oh my gosh, my family, someone in my family is sick. Are they going to be okay? That working memory isn't paying attention to what it's supposed to in class. Can also increase behaviors detrimental to learning. Generally behaviors we see in adults are different than behaviors in children, but you might see things like people being on their phones, not coming to class, coming late to class, not paying attention in class, talking to the neighbor, sending text messages. And we'll talk about this a little more later on as well. And also might include an aversion to tasks and processes, such as taking risks, starting a new task, responding to questions, or considering alternative viewpoints. And as we're going to see on the next slide, taking a risk might be, reading out loud in front of class, or even showing up to class and making yourself vulnerable. Okay. So we have this kind of continuum in our brain, where on the left side, what we have is that, I hesitate to use the word, I try to avoid using the word normal, but that sort of baseline of optimal brain function. And then over on the right-hand side, we have what happens when the fight, flight, or freeze reflex has been activated. So that hyperarousal continuum, we move from rest to vigilance to resistance to defiance to aggression. Cognitive style, how we think and process information, kind of optimally is abstract, able to see the big picture, but then moves to concrete, to emotional, to reactive, to reflexive. And then that internal state, how we feel inside, goes from calm to being aroused, to alarm, to fear, to terror. And so, as someone perceives threat to safety, someone is progressing through that arousal continuum that literally changes what part of their brain is running the show. So an adult learner who has experienced trauma or is experiencing high levels of stress, and trauma can be something that happened as a child, or someone who has a history of educational failure or humiliation, again, they're probably not starting at that ideal rest, abstract, and calm. They might already come into the classroom at resistance, emotional, and alarm because of what they are thinking about, where their body hormones and chemicals are. And if you're busy watching for danger and your central nervous system is preparing you to take action to protect yourself, you don't have bandwidth for learning. You're not able to think abstractly. You're responding to things emotionally. And that's where that looking at a math problem and having a really emotional response, that fear of math might happen. And really, in this way, that trauma and stress can harm the ability to learn because it kills curiosity and inhibits exploration. Because you can really only relax and open yourself to exploration of new ways of thinking, believing, and doing if you feel like you're not in danger and your body doesn't have to go into that fight, flight, or freeze to protect yourself. So what trauma looks like in a classroom all comes down to arousal. People can be hyper aroused, and this is where you have that hypervigilance, like we talked about, and this might manifest as inattention, hyperactivity, panic attacks, emotional dysregulation, just not being able to control their emotions, kind of going all over the place. Students might seem jumpy or seem unable to focus. And then you have hypoaroused. Oh, I see there's a typo in there. There should be a Y. Hypoaroused. And this can be disengagement, work refusal, kind of that low mood, sleeping, loss of interest, irritability. And it can also be things like anxiety, panic attacks, self-injury, disassociation, and isolation. So you might see that students seem emotionless or over-emotional, zoned out or shut down. And like we said before, this might result in people refusing to work with other students or with teachers. Okay, so for this section, I have one final video talking about the impact of trauma on learning in the classroom. This is a great video because it talks really about kind of that what's happening in your brain. So as you're watching it, be thinking, is this something that you have seen in learners? Do you see this? How does it manifest, particularly with your learners? And you also, every time I watch it, I definitely think about myself and how I experienced what he's talking about in the video with the different types of brains, how I experienced that in learning situations as well. Yeah, so watch this video with an eye to how does this manifest? Have you seen this manifest in the classroom with learners that you're working with? Again, if you're struggling to hear sound, the link will be shared afterwards and you can go back and you can watch it. You can watch it later on. And this is made for children, talking about children, but out of so many educational videos that I've watched around trauma, this one is really directly applicable to, in my experience and a lot of other adult teachers' experiences, what you see manifesting in adults.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. There's just about 10 seconds left of the video. But, you know, we're working with adults. Our students are not baby elephants. However, everything that he talks about with learning brain versus survival brain, I think is immediately applicable to adult learners. So in the chat, I would love to hear if you have ever witnessed or experienced in your classes when you're teaching any of what we've been talking about, particularly how does that survival brain manifest in classes? What have you seen and experienced? All right, so I'm seeing shutdown, distraction, frustration and quitting, that high emotion, tears. I've had so many students cry in my classes, and it's really hard. Yeah, that bursting into tears, getting up and leaving. I've seen anger, getting defensiveness, inability to focus, math anxiety, being paranoid. I like panicked, like I can't get this. It's the end, kind of the end of the world. Making jokes, yeah, and having test anxiety. Yeah, so we've all seen this, and the point of this presentation, the third part that we'll move into is talking about then what can we do to help with these behaviors and to help kind of even in these behaviors before they start, but also for us as teachers to build up that empathy of this isn't the learner's fault. This is as a result of brain chemistry, past experiences, things that are generally out of people's control, because that lack of control is really a huge part of the toxic stress and trauma. If we had control over what we were stressed about, we wouldn't need to be stressed. All right. So
a kid with trauma.
Last thing for this section before we take a brief break, I would like people to just think through this situation, the scenario, where you have, after class one day, a fellow teacher tells you, "I'm so frustrated at MUA. I put together a fun role play for the class. I pretended my bag had been stolen, and I had my friend, who's a police officer, come into the class to take my statement. MUA acted really upset and kept saying she doesn't like guns or police. It was super disruptive, and I had to ask her to leave before she ruined the whole experience for the rest of the class." So what I would like you to reflect on, kind of as you're in the break, and be thinking about, you can put things in the answer, you can kind of tuck this away to be thinking about it. We'll do a brief share out when we come back. But kind of what would you say? What have you learned from the session so far that you would use to help your colleague develop some empathy or understand what might have been going on with MUA, instead of being frustrated and blaming her for ruining the experience? Okay, so I want to make sure you get the break. So we're going to take our break. During the break, feel free to think about this, or also feel free to just kind of turn off completely. I'm keeping an eye on the timer, and so we're going to do let's do a 5-minute break. Again, this is a challenging topic, and we want to make sure that we are doing some self-care and taking the time that we need. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put a 5-minute timer up.
Let's go help people customize and save with Liberty Mutual.
First, I have to get through my YouTube ads. All right. So here's our puppy timer. I'll see you back here in 4 minutes and 46 seconds. Feel free to do whatever you need. And if what you need to do is sitting and looking at a video of puppies for the next 4 minutes, that is wonderful. See you back here shortly. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed 5 minutes of puppies. Kind of nice, can be kind of a nice thing to look at and turn your brain, turn your brain off from this really heavy topic that we are talking about. Also want to highlight some people put in responses and shared some experiences. So please go ahead and read the chat. And I also put in the book that I suggested, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, MD, if you're interested in learning more about the brain, the mind, body, and the healing of trauma. And I really appreciate what people put in, what they would say to their colleague that was having a trauma response. So giving this more permission to step away from the role play and maybe opening some space and opening a dialogue. Is there something that you want to talk about? Is there something I should know? Yeah. So yeah, and I see that Michelle also put in like taking somebody aside and listening, providing that space for somebody to talk. And also if someone doesn't want to talk, and I really appreciate that you said that don't take it personally, and that can be really hard. I see multiple people talking about, that this could have been a traumatic experience, could have been something that was triggering a memory of what happened with the police officer, and empathy should be, the kind of at the forefront of our minds. And also want to highlight somebody say, not making assumptions about solutions. That what works for us might be our go-to as a teacher, as an educator, might not be something that works for the learner, and being really aware of the assumptions. And I'm seeing multiple people, allowing the student to step out, giving them space to talk about it instead of making them leave, being aware of what might have happened in a learner's home country, that their experience with the police or their experience with their community here might be very different. All right, so thank you everybody who put in responses to that. Feel free to keep adding things in if things come up. I'm going to keep this moving, and we're going to go into the final section today, which is answering the question, how can we create learning environments where everyone can thrive? So here's where I'm going to be throwing a lot of recommendations at you. But I'm going to pause after each one and ask people, to take a minute and reflect at what's on the screen, and then share either in the chat or maybe jot down a note for you of something that you think would work for your learners, your particular teaching situation that you would like to try out. So strategies for for learners who are using resources and decreasing that hypervigilance, that's constantly scanning for threat and seeing threat where there isn't one. So that might mean, they ask a learner for help, or another student for help. The student says, no, I'm busy. And then the reaction is, they wouldn't help me. Why are you yelling at me? That can definitely happen in the classroom, and it's usually as a result of that hypervigilance that someone is experiencing. And remembering, if you're watching for danger and getting ready to take action, your system is preparing yourself to protect yourself. You really don't have a lot of bandwidth for learning. So some things that we can do, some concrete things, are really important. Having routines in the class and letting learners know changes ahead of time. So before people even come to class, they know what to expect. And if there's going to be a change, don't spring it on people, because that can move someone up through that hyperarousal continuum very quickly. Doesn't mean you have to do the same routine every day, but if there is going to be a change, just let people know in advance so that they have a little bit of processing time. Also, and this is, like we said, the hard one, but really important to at least be aware of and thinking of, is avoiding topics that have a high probability of triggering flashbacks. So there are some things that are really obvious: descriptions of war, pictures of violence, and videos. And if they need to be a part of what we're talking about, because we do need to talk about hard things and current events, give learners advanced warning when they can't be avoided, so we're not surprising them, because that surprise can be what triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response. But as I shared, and as we saw on the chat, and I have a colleague who had a learner have a flashback when they were doing just going through like things in the house, and one of the vocabulary items was screwdriver, because they had been tortured by a screwdriver. So we can't predict everything, but try to avoid topics, give warnings, and then, as what I saw coming up in the chat, give students a way to remove themselves from the situation. So this is something when I start teaching a new class that I say on the very first day: if you need to get up and leave, that is not a problem. You can come back when you're ready. You can come back later. I will talk to you if you want. No, but there will be no questions asked unless you want to talk to me. And if you have like a place in the school where people can go, you might want to like walk your class there, show them the space, and invite them to go and use it as needed if they need to step out of the class and just do some regulation on themselves. Also, make sure that learners feel welcome when they come to school. Encourage and build classroom community and build relationships. So we don't want to waste people's time. Adults are busy, they have busy lives, but we also need to make sure that people are having time to get to know each other and talk to each other, have some of those formal, structured, and then also the informal, unstructured conversations, and making time and acknowledging how important that is. And another thing that we can do for that decreasing hypervigilance is build an additional wait time. Somebody who has anxiety about school, they can be putting a lot of pressure on themselves. So if we make sure that we're always building in those pauses, we're going to ask the question, I'm going to have you do this task. There is going to be space and time for you to think. That can help decrease that anxiety when people know I will have time. So, a big thing of this is just don't be afraid of silence in the classroom. I know, especially if you're teaching remotely, it can feel really poisonous, but giving people that time to think and process is really critical. All right. So I'm going to play, this is about a 2-minute video from one of my colleagues, Jessica Jones, who's a 20-year plus adult education teacher in Minnesota, talking about in her class, she has conversation groups and what she sees as a result of that from her learners about the encouraging classroom community and building relationships. When we come back, I'll ask what will work the best for you. What is one thing that you want to be aware of and trying out?
I've been reading a lot lately about the importance of relationship building in education. That, for learning to happen, it's a consensual relationship among learners and teachers, and that if we want that learning to happen, it has to be supported by a really strong, genuine relationship and a value for students and what they bring to the classroom. And for me, this was embodied in a couple things that I heard from students in the last couple weeks. And one was a student who was talking about what she likes about coming to class. And our class is primarily focused on small group conversation. It's meant to help students stay connected during this time of virtual learning and feel less isolated while also continuing to work on some speaking fluency. And what she said is that, you know, she likes coming to conversation class because her life's really stressful lately. But when she comes to class, everything just kind of disappears for an hour. For an hour, she's focused in a different kind of speaking, an opportunity to engage with different topics that aren't part of her daily life. And I think that kind of experience is only possible if students feel safe with one another and safe with their teacher and in the environment that they're in. And the other was from a student who's been engaging in some conversation groups specifically for parents who are supporting students who are either learning at home or doing homework at home, school age kids. And she said that the reason the group has been so helpful for her is that it helped her to realize that she wasn't alone in the things that she was stressing about and that she was worried about. And that helped melt away some of that stress of supporting kids in distance learning. So those are just a couple of reasons why this work of building conversation skills is also, to me, as much about building safe relationships and valuing the ideas that learners bring to conversation.
All right, so you heard from Jessica about building relationships and valuing the ideas and making sure people feel that they're heard in the classroom. Anything from this list that really jumps out at you that you would like to take and use in your classes, or just build some awareness for yourself and your colleagues immediately? So I'm going to ask people, if you'd like, please just share what really jumps out for you for things that you can do for using resources, helping students focus the resources they need on their working memory in class and decrease hypervigilance. Anything jump out from this list or from what you heard from Jessica? So I see trust is a huge factor in feeling safe. So making sure that you're trustworthy, that permission to leave the scene, telling students in advance, making people feel welcome, letting people know. Yeah, I see that coming in a few times, letting people know what's coming, and the importance of classroom community and of not feeling alone. Yeah, our brains are primed for social learning. Like our brains are evolved to work socially and learn socially. And see, just showing interest in things that are important to students that help, and how that helps build trust. And just welcoming people as they're coming in, standing by the door. All right, so please feel free, keep sharing different ideas and different thoughts. Seen some other great things, giving explicit permission to disengage, making sure that routines are really helpful. Yes, yeah. And that is part of building that. Routines can be part of building the trust. And I see, definitely, it's as much as I can trying to not just tell you, but show you what you can do with that. Like letting people know if you need to step away, it's okay. Great. And allowing people to be upset and have feelings. We are human. And it is okay to have all of the feelings when things are going wrong. All right, we're going to move on to the next one. So I'm going to skip past the video. right? And we're going to talk about some strategies for attention and memory. So remembering that, in order to learn something, attention drives learning. You can't learn something that you don't pay attention to. So what are some things that we can do? First one is using images. So there was a study that was done where they had two groups of college students listen to the same 30-minute lecture, same taped 30-minute lecture. One group just listened, and one group listened and had pictures. And then 72 hours later, they tested their recall. And the group that just listened had on average about 10% recall. They could recall about 10% of what they heard in the lecture. The group that listened to the exact same lecture but had images, pictures throughout, had about a 65% recall. So huge difference that images make. Our brain love pictures. It makes us pay attention and helps us remember things. And what we were talking about earlier in that second section, how when somebody has experienced trauma, or it has that detrimental effects from PTSD, and the brain, that hippocampus has shrunk. What it really does is it impacts their ability to have those verbal memories, to remember things that they hear. It does not impact as much their ability to remember things they see. So using pictures is going to be good for all learners. Also, we pay attention to what is important to us. So making sure we're really clearly connecting classroom topics with learners' lives. We're doing past tense. We're not just going to conjugate a list of past tense verbs. We're going to practice doing past tense verbs in the context of talking about your health history or your child's health history with a doctor, or in a job interview. This is how this is going to help you outside of the classroom. We can also do some concrete learning strategies, like teaching learners how to take notes using keywords. And we might scaffold this where, we listen to something for 30 seconds or a minute, and then we pause it and we have people write down the 2 or 3 most important words that they heard, and build up until people can listen and take those keyword notes simultaneously. We want to, as much as possible, avoid lengthy statements and questions. When there's too much teacher talk, people tend to tune out. That decreases attention. Your brain gets caught by thinking about, that thing I read in the news this morning, or, oof, am I going to be able to buy rent, or here's what I have to go shopping for. So whenever we can, with making sure classes are learner-centered, that we're having plenty of opportunities for learners to respond, to be active, to break up the amount of speech that we're doing is really, really important. Also, our brains love success. It feels so good when we get something right, and we tend to start paying attention. So we obviously want to make sure that there is a lot of productive struggle happening in the class. That is how people learn, is through productive struggle. But it can't all be productive struggle. People have to have experiences where they can see what they have learned and feel good about themselves. There has to be times where things feel easy in class. If it's always hard, that's just exhausting. So providing opportunities for success might mean, doing games, doing activities, or you're reviewing things that people know really well. It might mean, if you're working with students who are struggling with literacy, starting out with having conversations about it where they can use all of their verbal language first. But making sure that people, can track what they're doing and can feel like they are doing well. Something that I've done that tends to work really well with people who are learning the language at a beginning level is I'll do recordings on my phone, just short, like look at this picture, describe what you see. And I'll do that like every 4 weeks or so. And then I'll play it back for people. Like, you've been here 8 months. Here's you describing the picture 8 months ago. Here's you describing a picture now. You can actually hear how much you've gained, because it can be hard to realize that when you're living it. And then also, we're working with adults, but we want to make sure that we are building up those independent learning skills. But at the same time, we also should be building in reminders for assignments, letting people know about those routine changes and what are the expectations for the class. We don't want to make assumptions that people are going to know how to be a successful learner or know how they are supposed to act in class. So making sure that that is really clear. And this might also mean providing rubrics or checklists for assignments. And one other thing I wanted to add, and this ties into those avoiding lengthy statements and questions, breaks are good. When we're talking about working memory, like what I read on average is researchers say it varies from person to person. It can be anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on the person. But when we kind of reach the end of that working memory, processing gets really hard. So it's important that we're building in breaks. And breaks don't have to be like what I did with a 5-minute break, putting up a puppy timer, or a coffee break where 15 minutes and everybody is up and moving and speaking different languages or having informal conversations. It can also be like, let's stand up and move our bodies. Let's stretch, stand up and stretch for a minute. Or if you're having people, find partners, if you're having people find partners, there's a picture cut in half and they have to find the partner who has the other half of the picture. They're not really thinking about anything academic. They're just looking around. They're in the moment. That can be a brain break. So don't be afraid to let students have breaks. All right, so I'm going to pause now. So we just went through 7 different strategies for attention and memory. What catches your attention? What would you like to try out with your learners? Go ahead and share in the chat. What stands out to you? All right, so I'm seeing images is coming up, note-taking strategies and rubrics, engaging differently, doing so having breaks, that opportunities for success. I remember I lived in Cambodia for 2 years and learning Khmer was so hard for me, but it felt so good when I would be out in the community and use it successfully, or I'd go into my tutoring session and I got something. It felt amazing and made me a lot more motivated. Yeah, so making sure people have success. This concrete example, connecting classroom topics with daily lives, like the 1918 pandemic and bubonic plague with COVID. And I've also seen other people talking about making connections and real life experiences. Mnemonic devices with images, yeah. Goal setting. People need to understand that something's important enough to learn. Great. All right, thank you, everybody. So it looks like there's some concrete ideas that people are able to taking away from this. And what we're talking about, this is trauma-informed teaching practices. It's going to be good for everybody, though. All learners, even learners who haven't experienced trauma, or who are, although I don't feel like there are many people at this point who have very low levels of stress in their life after the last 1.5 years. But it's going to be good for everybody. These are kind of best teaching practices. All right, so last section I'm going to talk through is some strategies for behavior, for increasing positive behavior. One thing we can do is give learners some control in the classroom. And this doesn't mean like okay, what do you want to learn today? I'll make up a lesson on the fly. It can be, we're doing these 2 activities today, these 2 phonics activities. Which one do you want to do first during our phonics time? Or things like stations, or letting people choose what they're going to do on the computer, what program they're going to work on the computer. One of those trademarks of stress and trauma is the lack of control. So having some control can be really helpful for people, and also builds that ownership. Encouraging laughter and having pauses for laughter and lightness in the classroom. At the beginning, we did a brief gratitude warm-up. So having pauses and times to talk about what's going well. Where is, if someone's learning a language, where's the time you successfully used the language in the last week? What's something that made you happy? And spending time talking about that. And then we always want to make sure that we are avoiding the stereotype threat. And this is, a predicament where kind of situational, where people feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. So, for an example, for me, there's a lot of stereotypes about women being emotional. So, I have this really strong feeling about what's happening with learners and how people are being taught, but I have to couch it in academic terms. I can't talk about my emotions because I don't want to come across as the emotional female. And so these stereotype threat can be connected to gender, to race, to ethnicity, to age, to differing abilities, to whether somebody is the oldest child, youngest child, immigration status, all of these. So making sure that we're being really aware of what stereotypes are present, and are we putting people in situations where they might feel vulnerable. And also the stereotype threat doesn't always have to be a negative stereotype. It can be giving someone expectations about how they're supposed to act based on the group that they belong to, that they may not live up to or feel like they can live up to, that can feel really damaging and like I'm disappointing the teacher. So, for example, making an assumption that somebody who is Asian, who's immigrated recently from China, is going to have high math skills. If that person is not good at math, that can be an extra level of pressure that the teacher thinks I'm going to be good at it. So be aware of the stereotype threat and be aware of the negative as well, the positive as well as the negative stereotypes people might be worried about. Some other strategies for behavior is trying to avoid looming and or hovering over and around learners. So this can be kind of a physically coming up to behind someone, or coming up to a desk and standing over someone and looking down. Whenever possible, if we're in person, we want to, be sitting down, be on the same level, be making it more conversational. And that hovering can be, like I said, a physical, and it can also be like, I'm watching you do work. And that can happen a lot if you're working one-on-one with a learner, if you have tutors working one-on-one, that feeling of I'm being watched and judged and there's more pressure, that can cause, I think someone said, students bursting into tears during tutoring sessions, that feeling of being watched. So it's okay, and it can feel weird I'm going to let you work, you're going to work, and I am going to engage in something else. I have a GED teacher that I know who will do a lesson, and then for the practice, everybody gets off Zoom and comes back on 20 minutes later to share and work through things so that people don't feel like they're being watched while they're working. Also, we want to start strong and gain some buy-in for each class topic. So it connects to what we talked about before. Making sure people understand why the topic is important, how it is going to help them. Familiar environments. Someone had mentioned test anxiety. if we are pulling learners out of their classroom into a different space to take a test, so they're being removed from a familiar environment to an unfamiliar environment, that can spike anxiety and can cause that person to advance through the arousal continuum and make it a lot harder for cognitive processing to happen. So if you can, testing people, doing high pressure things in a familiar environment, or giving people opportunities to spend time in that space before you ask them to do something stressful, like take a test. Or if learners are moving up to a next class level, giving them a chance to just go in and sit back and observe before they're just shifted into a new class. And then finally, using positive words to prime. If somebody is really stressed and we tell them, don't worry, what are they going to hear? They're going to hear worry. So just being aware of what words you're using. You know, if someone's feeling bad about themselves and we say, you have 3 mistakes, they're going to hear the word mistakes. Instead, can we say, you have 3 opportunities to improve or to make it better? All right, so pausing for a second. What from these strategies for behavior sticks out to you? So we had these 4: positive words, familiar environments, starting strong, and avoiding looming or hovering. And then we had our slide before with control, laughter, gratitude, and avoiding the stereotype threat. So really quickly in the chat, what sticks out to you? All right, I'm seeing control coming up a lot, making people part of the decision-making process. Also seeing positivity and laughter. Using that positive words, graphic organizers, being aware of looming. Yeah, positive words and affirmation. Okay. And one thing I know I kind of always have to be aware of is positive. We need to laugh. We need to have fun. You also want to make sure that you're giving respect and space for people's feelings and avoiding that toxic positivity where someone's like, oh, I'm stressed. This is hard. This math is hard. And you're like, no, you got it. You're great. That's no problem. This is going to be so easy. That kind of toxic positivity can be harmful. So making sure we're being positive, but we're not ignoring or downplaying learners' negative feelings as well. Yeah, and we can show resilience and talk about resilience. We can stay positive and also model how we, like, this is stressful. I'm having a hard time. Here's what I'm doing to get through it. All right, so last thing I want to talk about is some strategies for the teacher. So first off, and I feel like I've seen this pop up in the chat already, is remembering it's not about you. If someone is experiencing toxic stress, if somebody is experiencing PTSD, you know, it's what's happening to them, and you need to, and I need to, not take it personally, because that can really change just how we teach and how we respond, not just to that student, but to everyone. We also want to make sure that we're focusing on connecting with learners and also reaching out to other teachers and volunteers and coordinators for support for ourselves as well. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next couple of slides. We also want to try avoid labeling learners based on behaviors and past experiences. So this is something that was really brought home to me when I was listening to a speaker at a LESLA conference, and she said, why do we call people refugees for the rest of their lives after they have come to the United States? Once somebody has been resettled, they are not a refugee. They have come home. They have found a new home. Why do we continue to label people as refugees? forever. So kind of thinking about that is making sure that we're thinking about people as individuals and not just thinking about them based on, you were a refugee, this happened, you're undocumented, I know that this happened to you, or this is my student, this is my disruptive student, this is my late student. Also knowing as a teacher, it's okay to be not okay. This is hard work, and God knows right now this is hard times. It is okay if you are not okay. And I see from Elizabeth, sharing with respectfully and in a way that is not going to burden students, but sharing your own experiences can be really helpful for learners to see that as well, but also for us. And then recognize what you can and can't control and focus instead on what you can influence. You can't control whether or not somebody gets enough sleep and wakes up on time to come to class. But what you can control is what happens when they get there. Do they still feel welcome? Are you able to roll them into the lesson? Do you do a check-in with them to see if they're okay? Those are things that you can control. You can't control people's lives outside of the classroom, and letting go of that can be really helpful. We're gonna kind of end this session. The last thing, we've been talking and really focusing a lot on our learners. I do want to spend just a few minutes as we're wrapping up talking about the impact of stress and trauma on teachers, particularly in the form of compassion fatigue, because this is just a really important thing to address and acknowledge because it tends to happen. And compassion fatigue is really that emotional residue of strain and exposure to working with those who are suffering from trauma and toxic stress. And as we saw when I said, what kind of stressors are learners experiencing right now, so many things came up. So I know that people are aware of it and thinking about it. And it can occur due to exposure from a singular instance. So, something that happens in class, or hearing a really hard story, having a learner who had a flashback and being with them through that, that can be something that can trigger compassion fatigue, or it can be just kind of a gradual, slow buildup. And compassion fatigue is really an umbrella term. And we can also think of this as burnout, vicarious trauma, or secondary traumatic stress. The stress that somebody experiences from hearing and talking and kind of living and caring about people who have experienced trauma, or are experiencing trauma, or experiencing that toxic stress. So this is something, it's well researched and it's very real, and that it's okay to be not okay if this is something that you are feeling. And I have a very close colleague who does a lot of work. She trains social workers, and she works in K-12 and trains teachers on trauma. And one of the big things she talks about is what to do with compassion fatigue. And her catchphrase that I'm adopting for this is, self-care is more than yoga. There is a lot more to what we can do than just sitting, taking 10 minutes and doing yoga. It's a workplace hazard for somebody who is a helping profession, and teachers, educators, this is a helping profession. So just like if you are working in a warehouse and you have to be careful about how you lift heavy things, we have to be aware that working as teachers, we are going to, probably people who are trusted, we're going to hear and see hard things. So we really want to focus on building resilience. How do we make ourselves stronger? And this might be therapy, having group discussions, talking with other teachers, letting go of what we can't control, rather than the self-care, yoga, scented candles, bubble bath. So if you want to do more reading on this, rather than looking at self-care, look at how do educators build resilience. So this might also mean you need to work with your employer to manage workload as needed. This is a really good conversation to have with supervisors to talk about this work is really hard, and you might need some breaks or need something taken off your plate if you are working through vicarious trauma or secondary trauma or compassion fatigue. Because what we don't want is people to leave the field because it's too much, because that happens all of the time. So, recommendation, use your paid time off if you have it. If there are supervisors here, make sure that the people you supervise are using it and make sure that they have it. And people need to have chances to step away and really decompress. So ultimately, you as a teacher need the same things that the students need and that we've been talking about. You need to regulate, you need to be able to relate and reason. You need to know where you are and how you're centered. You need structure and predictability. And being able to nurture yourself emotionally, physically, socially, and spiritually, whatever works for you, whatever community you're able to tap into, or whatever thing that you do at home to be able to turn off your mind and be in the present moment and engaging with something that isn't work and isn't the hard stories you're hearing. All right, so as we're wrapping up, I have a second scenario for you. And I'd love to just see some responses in the chat to what you would recommend that the colleague does differently. During a department meeting, one of your teaching colleagues begins to complain about learners in her beginning level ESL class. They never seem to want to participate in group activities, and when I call on them to read out loud, they just look at me and shake their head. I finally snapped today and told them if they wanted to learn English, they're going to have to participate. They're just holding themselves back. So what could your colleague have done differently in this situation? Or what would you recommend that your colleague do? So think of those trauma-informed suggestions that we've been talking about. Oh, and I'm just looking at this right now from Michelle, and I really would like to lift this up. So making sure you have an educator community of other teachers that you're able to talk to about issues is really important. But I love what Michelle put here of being careful not to engage in gossip. And we can paint negative pictures or bias in the minds of our colleagues when we state all the ways our students rub us the wrong way. And making sure that we allow colleagues to form their own opinions and relationships with students when they're meeting students for the first time. Thank you for sharing that. That is so true, and can be so easy to do, especially when you as a teacher are stressed. Our brain focuses on the negative. So just being aware of that. Thanks. All right, so I'm seeing a few different things. Taking breaks, reading the passage out loud. Allowing a silent period so learners can absorb information. Remembering it's not about you, it's about what they learn. The colleague has labeled them and needs to not give up. I've seen a few people saying reading the passage first, having the instructor read out loud first. Expressing to students that class is a wonderfully safe place to practice and make mistakes. We all make mistakes and it's okay. In our class family to stumble like that. I observed a teacher once who would always say, "That's a beautiful mistake. I love your mistake." Or I'm so glad you said that. And I know she was using non-positive language, but the way she said it was so enthusiastic, and her students were not afraid to take risks because she'd say, "I love that you're doing that because I can see that you're trying. Here's how I can see your thought processes are going. This lets me know what we need to go over again." She was so enthusiastic, and it really helped students feel more comfortable. Great. So lots of different things, including talking to students, having students pair and speak with each other, making sure we're putting the students first, asking for input and giving students space and time to maybe read to themselves or work in small groups. Use some of the native language. Even just a simple greeting can really make a difference. All right, great, wonderful suggestions. I see we are at time, and we've been really pausing and reflecting. So I'm gonna just jump past the 1 to 2 suggestions people have been sharing as we've been going. So we're gonna jump past this. And I just really want to say thank you. Thank you so much to everybody for being here, for spending 2 hours digging into this really complex topic that all of us have had probably a lot of experiences with. And I really hope that you got some ideas that you can take back and use in your classes, or a shift in perspective made you think of something a little different. And I also really appreciated all of the ideas and thoughts that people shared. I feel like I learned a lot. So I want to lift up, Marcia put in, please complete the survey. So there's a survey for you to talk about. And as people are kind of wrapping up, I also have one more book to share with you. Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. This is one of the best teaching books I've ever read. And I'm going to put this in the chat, and I'll also send these book recommendations along with my slides that hopefully they can get shared out.
Hold on, Missy. Hold on. Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrea, for this informative work, this informative breakout. I have really enjoyed it, and I know that everyone else has, and I'm so excited to see that everyone was so active and actively involved in this as well. So thank you so much, and if everyone will just give Andrea a thumbs up in the chat, and we really do appreciate you. We're going to give away our yes, ma'am. We're going to give away our second door prize, and our second door prize is going to be a complete set of basic workbooks by, I think it's KET. It's going to be one set of online courses, Fast Forward and Workplace Ready or Workplace Essential Skills. And the winner is Brandy Woods, the Intake Assessment Specialist at UA Cossatot. So that will get sent to you, Brandy. We'll get that to you. But congratulations on that win. Before we end, I just wanted to remind everyone that in the morning from 8 to 9, we will be having our annual membership business meeting. Please try to make a point to join us for our business meeting. This is when we're going to go over and discuss things that are upcoming and for our future, and elect new officials as well. So have a blessed rest of your day, and see you all in the morning.